We're really excited to have you all here for this policy teach-in. There's some really important topics, and obviously, fortunately, we're in a better time for hopefully immigration reform. So we really wanted to, bring this work, this knowledge to all of you, and be able to, strengthen all of our advocacy together. So that is our mission for today. I will introduce our speakers. We have some folks coming together from our really awesome coalition. So first off, we'll have Megan Essaheb from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Next, we'll have Mahnoor Hussain from South Asian Americans Leading Together, or SALT. Next, we'll have Diana Konate from African Communities Together. And then Alyssa Diaz from Church World Service. And closing out, we'll have Justin Vallis from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago. And I gotta say, I feel really lucky to be in company with all these awesome policy experts. So definitely, if you have questions, ask them during this webinar, but also, feel free to reach out to our coalition, and we have a really great body of knowledge here. So really excited to get to dig in. And just to introduce Value Our Families, if this is your first time on a webinar with us or meeting with us, this is just some background. So Value Our Families is a national coalition focused on strengthening family immigration and really creating an immigration system informed by compassion, love, and reuniting families. So overall, that is our motivating principle. So all of our work falls under that. And last year, just some really top highlights. We pushed back on the Trump administration's anti-immigrant attacks. So some of those include the 2020 immigration ban, which this year has been revoked, public charge, a lot of negative policies like the Muslim ban, the African ban, deportations. So, we take our work really thinking about how are immigrant families treated or separated, and how do we fight that? So one signature piece of legislation from the coalition is the Reuniting Families Act, which we'll go much more into depth on, but that is a bill that we had originally gotten 78 co-sponsors in Congress. And so now that we're in the new Congress, actually the provisions from Reuniting Families Act have been included in the 2021 US Citizenship Act. So it's really just like a reflection of this, bigger emphasis on making family immigration an important priority for all of us and making sure that immigrant families themselves are at the forefront of this advocacy. And finally, the Value Our Families Coalition itself has 250 plus members. That includes organizations, individuals, volunteers. We really open our doors to everyone because everyone has a stake in this work and can contribute. So, and we're coordinating our third Advocacy Week of Action at the end of March, which we will talk about in the closing and the call to action. But yeah, if you're not a part of Value Our Families, please do join us. We'll share those links later on. So thanks. And I will first pass it over to Megan.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm Megan Essaheb again with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and we just really wanted to take a step back and make sure we're covering kind of the current law and how the system is, because I know a lot of times we're talking about these policy proposals and how to fix things, and not everyone necessarily knows, the details of how the current law, the problems with the current law, the good and the bad, and exactly how we're trying to fix it. So with that, I'm going to start with a couple overviews, pulling my data from the Migration Policy Institute, where you can, read a lot more immigration statistics, but just the big number, 44.9 million immigrants are living in the US. That's the total non-citizen number. I think over half of them are naturalized citizens. And then 13.7% of the total US population, which is not the historic high, which was in 1890, at 14.8%. And 1890 was also a time when we saw a lot of anti-immigrant legislation, like the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the creation of the public charge rule, which is, some of you may be familiar with. So we're coming off the Trump era with anti-immigrant policies, and it's important to note, the overall numbers is around 1 million people in 2019 became lawful permanent residents, and that number was down from 2016, where we saw that the high end of 1.2 million people becoming lawful permanent residents in the United States. So we did see decline in immigration under Trump with all his harmful policies, the immigration bans, the African ban, the Muslim ban, public charge rule, all the anti-asylum policies, all the shutdown of the refugee program had an impact. And of course, that's 2019 numbers, so we don't have all the data on 2020 yet, which will, I think, even be lower. I think it's just important to understand that consistently over 50%, and in 2019, 55% of the people who got green cards already lived in the United States. And so Justin's going to talk at the end about the undocumented population, but the people in the US either were undocumented or they could be on temporary visas and non-immigrant status. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what we're covering today is like the major pathways to green cards, which are called immigrant visas. We're not talking about non-immigrant visas or temporary visas, just so we're clear on that, because there's a whole other world. I mean, a little bit, Mahnur might touch on it a little bit, but it's too much to cover in one webinar. So family-based green cards, again, in 2019, we saw 49% of that million people who got green cards were in the immediate relative category, which is unlimited, which I'll go over again. 226,000 were in the family preference visa categories. So these are capped categories for adult children of citizens or lawful permanent residents and siblings of US citizens, which I'm going to go over in depth in a minute. And then employment-based green cards, 140,000 per year. It was 14% in 2019. Diversity visas, 55,000, 4% in 2019. And humanitarian programs accounted for 10% in 2019. And that's refugees, which Alyssa is going to talk about, and then also asylum seekers, and then VAWA, trafficking visas and visas for victims of certain crimes are a smaller proportion or number of the green cards there. Next slide, please. So within, as I just mentioned, so we have the category of immediate relatives, which is the spouses of US citizens and minor children under 21 years old of US citizens and parents of US citizens are in this immediate relative category that's completely uncapped. And I'll show you a chart in a second, but there's the family-based categories and the employment-based categories that are outside of immediate relatives all have a 7% country cap. So that means the green cards they give out for each country cannot go over 7% in that year. And so that's why we see longer waits, which I'll show you in a minute, for countries, particularly Mexico, China, India, Philippines, Vietnam, because we have more people coming from those. I mean, some of those countries have much bigger populations than other countries, but also we have historical relationships with certain countries, like the Philippines, where more people have immigrated, and then there's more demand on those visas as well. And just a note here that these limits and these caps apply to immigrants, whether or not they're inside or outside the country. So we talk about people who are inside the country as adjusting their status, and people outside the country as applying for visas. But if they're going through those categories that are subject to the country caps and to the numerical limits, they count. Doesn't matter if you're inside or outside the country. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is the breakdown, and I have this slide in a Google Doc too, which I think I put in the resources if you want to spend some time looking at it. But this shows you all the family categories, where I showed you the first line, immediate relatives, how they're unlimited. That part of the immigration system works great, except when we have processing problems. If there's processing delays, or like now we just had a immigration ban due to COVID, then those visas, those green cards can get slowed down, but otherwise works pretty well. As you'll see, it just takes like the time it takes for the government to process those green cards is usually 6 months to a year, which is a little bit long, but not as bad as you're going to see in the next category. So the first family preference category is US citizens can sponsor their unmarried adult children. I should say sons and daughters, but so child under the immigration laws is defined as under 21, and they usually talk about sons and daughters when they're over 21. That's the formal words they use, but of course they're still children. So there's 23,400 green cards given out for that category a year. And then if you look to the top, just to look at the columns on the right, because of those 7% country caps I talked about, there are countries that have longer wait times, and the State Department reports the wait times separately for Mexico, India, and the Philippines, not Vietnam, but they probably should for Vietnam. But historically they report separate wait times for those countries because there's such high demand. So then they say all other countries. So what you're seeing in the second to the right column is for this first family preference, the wait time right now, they're processing applications for people who applied 6 years ago in 5 months. And then if you look to the right, it gets much worse if you're from Mexico. It's much longer for all those countries I named, but Mexico, I just wanted to give you an example. So I put here the country with the longest wait time, which is always Mexico. And it's 20, not always, but in all of these categories is Mexico, 23 years and 1 month. They're processing applications for people who petitioned for their adult child to come to the US 23 years ago in 1 month. I don't need to go, so you get how to read the chart now. I don't need to go through each one, but I'll just show you, they break out whether for 2A and B, being married or not married matters. So 1 is unmarried adult children, third preference is married adult children, and then within 2B, for lawful permanent residents, they cannot sponsor married adult children. So that causes problems. They can only sponsor unmarried adult children. So if you're waiting in line because your mom is a green card holder in the US and she's sponsoring you, then you have this long line and it can impact your decisions, like even your decision to get married, right? Because if you were to get married, you would lose your green card application. You'd lose your money you put in, and you might have been waiting a few years. So then people have to make decisions like, I'm not going to get married until I get this green card, which is, crazy. People make other decisions, right? Like, where are you settling and investing your life? I'm waiting 6-7 years for a green card in the US. Like, how much do I invest in my education here in the Philippines? How much do I don't want to buy a house because maybe I'm going to move. So, I think I'm seeing chats. I can answer though. We can do it questions later, but current means they're processing them now. So that means there's no backlog. That means that if you apply today, they're going to start processing you pretty soon. It's more like the first category, 6 months to a year, however long it takes them to actually process your paperwork. It's interesting that it's current now because I just looked at these numbers, right? They were not current a couple of years ago. So I think that they've gotten current because of Trump's immigration ban, but I'm going to look into that more in the future. And then, just look at the numbers. So third preference category, US citizen, sponsoring their married adult children, we've got 24 years, 5 months for Mexico, 18 years, 11 months for the Philippines. And then the fourth preference category, US citizens sponsoring their brothers or sisters, is 22 years for Mexico, 19 years for the Philippines, and just slightly less for like India and China and Vietnam. So I guess the other point to make about that, the important point is this is the wait time we have for now, for what they're processing now. We don't actually have a good projection of the future. So if you apply today, this is not how long you wait. If you apply today for your sister to sponsor your sister to come to the US. For the Philippines, it's like 100 years. Like they're not even, for siblings, they're not even encouraging people to apply because the wait is so long.
There's some great questions, Maggie.
Yes.
I can read them out to you if that's
Sure.
easier.
Sure.
F2A is also unmarried for minor child. All right.
F2A, yes, sorry if I said that incorrectly. F2A is the sponsor is a lawful permanent resident. So it matters who the person is sponsoring. If the person is sponsoring as a US citizen, then the minor child is uncapped. But if the person sponsoring is a lawful permanent resident, then children under 21 have to go in that category as well. That's the current category. If they haven't already gotten in on the green card. So, they may have, if they come in on an employment visa and that child is already or has a relationship to them, they may come in with them. But, where you have stepchildren situations, more common, you see that they need to actually sponsor, or for other like economical reasons, people come first and then they want to sponsor the child later. And then I think I see that 7% country cap is not for the immediate relative category, the one that's dark blue. The 7% country cap does not apply to the immediate relative category. It applies to every other family category on here, and it applies to the employment-based categories. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is fuzzy. I wasn't quite sure of the year. I think this is 2018 numbers because I copied it from a little bit older fact sheet, but this just shows you right in a pie graph that Mexico has the bulk of people in line, and we don't know how many, but a lot of them are probably undocumented people in the US. So, I think Justin will talk more about how there's overlap, but you see Philippines, India, Vietnam, China, Bangladesh, Dominican Republic, Pakistan, Haiti, El Salvador, and then we have everybody else. Next slide, please. On to what are we trying to do about this? So those are the problems with the family-based system, and the Value Our Families campaign supports, as Vivian already mentioned, Congresswoman Judy Chu's Reuniting Families Act. We were very happy to see that most of the bill was included in the Biden's US Citizenship Act. There was with I think one exception or two that we're not happy about, and Justin's going to talk about the big one. But what it does, so in the 90s, there were years when the government just didn't process up to those caps. I don't really know what was going on. Some in the 2000s, but they were just not, the bureaucracy was not functioning. Maybe it was intentional, I don't know, but they didn't process them, and they don't roll over to the next year. And so they do actually roll over to the next year. They roll over to employment, but for whatever reason, they didn't even roll over then. They were totally lost. And we want to just recapture all those unused visas. It's like a few 100,000 in family, and I think more in employment, 500,000 in employment. And then we want to somebody was just asking about this. The minor children and spouses of lawful permanent residents, we want to move to that immediate relative category, so it is not capped and it is unlimited. And that's there's a lot of agreement on that. And everybody that works on visa reform. And then derivatives is a legal term that just means the spouses and minor children of people as they come in. So I should have explained this before. It's a problem. So if I sponsor my sister and she's coming in, then she's allowed to bring her spouse and her 3 children, but they all count towards the cap. It doesn't count as one person coming in. It counts as 4 people towards the country cap and towards the categorical caps, and that's same in employment. So we want to end that. So it just counts as one visa towards the caps. And then, sorry, my son showed up. And then 10-year maximum wait time. So the goal is to really clear the backlogs, but even if there were backlogs that would happen again, or there continue to be some backlogs, there would be a 10-year max wait time. So anybody who's in line for 10 years, they're not subject to any of these caps anymore, and they could just get their green card processed, and lifts that 7% number to 20% for family. Next slide, please. And the bill, the Reuniting Families Act also includes LGBTQ equality. So it adds permanent partner throughout the INA, which I think is particularly important for people who are living in countries where same-sex marriage is not legal, so they can bring their partners as spouses, and it fixes this problem that was showing up in the news a couple of years ago about, and there's active litigation about how same-sex partners abroad, when they're having children through assisted reproductive technology, are not being, those children, if one parent is a US citizen, because they're not born on US soil, they're not getting citizenship that way. And they're not getting citizenship through their parent unless they prove a genetic relationship. That is not the way hetero couples are treated. If the couple's married, and it doesn't matter if like they don't do a genetic test for the father, for example, or the mother. They're just like, okay. So that's discriminatory. So we fix that. And then there's some fixes for orphans, widows, and stepchildren, because when the petitioner dies, sometimes people can lose their application or their place in line. It would fix that. And for stepchildren, it would also has a fix to treat them more equally. And then there's an issue with children aging out, because there's that line of children being under 21 and where they fit in all these applications, and it kind of locks in their age from when they apply. And then first place in line. Okay, so that's an issue where, when I was talking about, you can get, like, it can mess you up when you get married, like, or if you you might be eligible in two different ways, right? You might already be in line under one category, like a sibling category, but then your trying to think, your mother suddenly becomes, a citizen and can sponsor you, and you're trying to figure out, like, what's better for me being, like, in the front of the line. It would, like, the best would keep you in the best option either way, so you don't have to, like, switch your application. And then there's also this, it incorporates another bill, which is a fix for the children of Filipino World War II veterans. So those were Filipino folks who fought in World War II in the US military, and they weren't granted citizenship, I think, until 1990. And so by then, when they were granted citizenship, their children were not under 21 anymore. So if their children had been under 21, then their children would have gotten, their green card citizenship status, but their children were all older. So there's like long wait times. And so it would just also take them out of all the caps and allow them to adjust their status if they want, get green cards if they want to. I think that's it for me. But let's check the next slide. And I'll hand it over to Mahnur.
Thanks, Megan. That was really great. I actually learned a lot there. Hi, everyone. My name is Mahnur Hussain from South Asian Americans Leading Together. I use she, her pronouns, and just wanted to go over the employment-based visas, current law, and then as well as the proposed solution. So just a bit of a background. I myself was an H-4 dependent, and then eventually, after 13 years of waiting, we received our green card. So this is a very important issue for our community as South Asians, but then largely as AAPI communities. So employment-based visas, there are several ways for foreign workers to enter the US for employment purposes, either on a temporary or on a permanent basis. There's various categories. There's e-visas for traders and investors, religious occupations is R visas, and then H, as many of us know, for temporary workers. And the current system allows certain workers the ability to adjust their status and become lawful permanent residents. This happens either through self-petitioning or the employer can petition or sponsor the worker. And as Megan mentioned, there's a numerical limit of how many green cards are available each year. So currently it's 140,000 per year. And so this number also, as Megan mentioned, includes the eligible spouses, the minor children. And so obviously the actual number of employment-based immigrants visas is less than 140,000 each fiscal year because each dependent counts as a visa. In particular, the 140,000 visas are divided into 5 preference categories. The first is EB1, which you'll see in the slide, which is for individuals in sciences, arts, education, business, athletics, and other sort of multinational executives. The second preference, which is EB2, it's for individuals with advanced degrees and other sort of exceptional people. Third is for skilled workers, professionals, and other workers. And then fourth is for certain special immigrants. And the fifth is for folks who are creating employment. So on top of the numerical limit of 140,000, there's also this 7% per country limit per year. And this has caused a significant delay in wait periods for individuals who are waiting for their green cards because some preference categories such as EB2 and EB3 have a higher wait list and higher demand. So certain countries such as India, China, and Mexico and Philippines are experiencing a backlog of what looks like 11 years, but is actually much, much bigger. So around 100 years for some individuals from certain countries. So again, this obviously presents challenges on its own because people are not allowed to change their employers and then often find themselves in exploitative work environments. And so advocates have been really trying to figure out proposed solutions that really aim to clear the backlog for employment-based visas. And that's where the Reuniting Families Act comes in. Next slide. So in particular, the bill addresses all of these issues that I mentioned. So between 1992 and 2009, there was over 500,000 unused employment-based visas, which again could go to eliminate the backlog. So the first provision of the bill that's really helpful is that it recaptures those immigrant visas that are lost and automatically rolls over to the next fiscal year. The other piece about the bill is that it reclassifies spouses, permanent partners, and minor children as immediate relatives. So again, it sort of ends the counting of derivatives towards those caps. Other pieces, it raises the per country limit. So it raises it from 7% to 20% for both family and employment-based. And then other piece, it creates a 10-year maximum wait time. Of course, that's not something that's preferable, but it is much better than the solution, than the current situation we have. And also it provides relief for spouses, permanent partners, and children who are on H-4 visas and grants them work authorization. As we know, not all partners of or dependents of H-1B visa holders have the ability to work. And then it also prevents H-1B dependents from aging out of the H-4 visa by basically freezing the age on the employment-based petition as the age of the child. So even if they are older than 21, they'll still be counted. So overall, these provisions are a shared strategy that strengthen the employment-based visa system. And it's definitely something that has been led by immigrant rights experts and multi-ethnic coalition. And next, I'm going to pass it on to Diana from African Communities Together to talk about diversity visas.
Thanks, Maknoor. So hi, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Diana Kanate. I am Policy Director at African Communities Together. And I will be touching on the Diversity Visa Program. So the Diversity Visa Program was created in 1991. And the aim of the program was to increase diversity in the flow of immigrants coming to the US. And it does that by making visas available for immigrants from countries with historically low rates of immigration to the US. It has turned into a major pathway for Africans to immigrate to the US. So this is a visa program that is of great importance to the African community, but the program does benefit many would-be immigrants around the world. Some of the top sending countries through the diversity visa have been Egypt, Nepal, Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Iran until the Trump Muslim ban. But to be eligible for the program, an individual needs to be from a country with historically low rates of immigration to the US. And the countries that currently, there are a few countries that I believe maybe about 18 to 20 countries that are not able to participate in the program, but a vast majority of countries around the world are able to participate. So that's the first requirement, that an individual be from one of those countries that can participate. And another requirement being that the individual meets the education and employment requirement. Those were basically the only two requirements for applying for the diversity visa program until the Trump administration came into office. And Trump, former President Trump, really had, did whatever he could to try to eliminate this program. There were several proposals in Congress to eliminate the program. Luckily, none of those, those went nowhere. But what he wasn't able to do legislatively, he did administratively. So one of the requirements that the Trump administration implemented was, or is, the passport rule. So now an individual is also required to have a valid unexpired passport before they're able to apply for the program. Essentially what this results in is preventing low-income individuals and Black immigrants from the potential pool of diversity visa applicants. And as a result of the passport rule, there was a significant drop in DV applicants overall, over 50% drop in DV applicants after the passport rule was implemented. And there was there were 5 million less applications from people in African countries. Sierra Leone, for example, is a country that had its DV applications almost wiped out. It had 94% less applications as a result of this passport rule. So that's been an issue that we've seen. That wasn't the only way that the Trump administration attacked the program, though. It attacked it through the Muslim and Africa bans. Those folks who were banned, those countries the ban also prevented individuals from those countries from participating in the DV program. Then last year, he totally suspended the program with his immigration ban. So that's essentially where things stood after the Trump administration. When Biden came in, we were happy that on day one, he repealed the Muslim and Africa bans, opening up or allowing folks to come into the country. Unfortunately, DV recipients were still blocked from coming into the country because there was still the suspension of the DV program. But happily, the administration has also repealed the immigration ban. I think that happened about 2 weeks ago. So folks who won the DV program and had their visas have been coming into the country. So we are very thankful for that. Unfortunately, these bans have created additional headaches for people who at the time of the Muslim ban weren't able to even get their visas, their diversity visas, because of those bans. So now we're working on pushing the administration to fix that issue, both the administration and Congress, actually. So, so that's the DV program. Next slide, please. So where are we now? Happily, we are in better times with a new administration, one that is not actively trying to eliminate the program. But we also have two major legislative proposals that would impact the program. The first being the RFA, which increases the number of available diversity visas from 55,000 to 80,000. And the second being the Biden bill, the USCA, which takes the language from the RFA and also increases the diversity visas from 55,000 to 80,000. With that, we're happy to see that the Biden administration has committed itself to diversity in the immigration system by including that in his bill, or in the bill in his bill. But we're also hopeful that his administration will repeal the passport rule, which is still in effect, which still impacts which still impacts people who are able to apply for the program. So that's a general overview of the program, where we've come from, where we are now. And let me see if there are questions that I can answer before I pass it on. I think, when is the next DV visa application? So the application cycle typically opens around October or November. So around late October, early November is when the DV application cycle will open. It will remain open for 30 days. So people around the world will have 30 days to apply for the program. After that, the application, the website closes. And then in May of the following year, people will find out whether they won whether they were selected for the program. And then once they're selected for the program, they can gather their documents, they have visa appointments, and then they have until it's a 2-year program. They have until September of the following year to get their visa in hand and make it to the US. Anyways, that's the basic program. And let me see, I think those were all the DV questions that I saw. And if so, I will pass it on to Alyssa, who will be discussing the refugee program.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Diaz. I'm with Church World Service, and I'll be going through the Refugee Resettlement Program and the ways this relates to family unity and our priorities within Value Our Families as well. So some background on the US Refugee Admissions Program. The modern program was created in 1980 when Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1980 with bipartisan support. So the modern program has been around for over 40 years, about 41 years now, with bipartisan support. And additional background on that for the refugee admissions goal each year is set by the president after consulting with Congress, which is required by law. So every year the administration consults with ranking members of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and Immigration Subcommittee to talk about the refugee admissions goal for the upcoming fiscal year. And it's important to note, which I'll allude to later on, that the president also has legal authority to admit additional refugees through a revised mid-year presidential determination. And this is important for our current context, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And from 1980 until about a few years ago, the average refugee admissions goal was 95,000, and that was supported and celebrated with bipartisan support, except we saw some dismantlement of the program. Some is an understatement. We saw heavy dismantlement of the program under the Trump administration in the last 4 years. So now we're in a current moment where we're doing a lot of oversight and needing to rebuild the infrastructure of the resettlement program and strengthen it. And another thing I want to touch on in relation to family unity for refugees and that being a priority for the refugee resettlement program as well. We know that family unity is really critical to immigrants and refugees' well-being and integration and success. Unfortunately, as it currently stands within the US Refugee Admissions Program, it's too narrowly defined, and there's a heavy backlog for family reunification for refugees. And so two of the ways that refugees are resettled together or are reunified within the US is through Form I-730. So a person who is resettled within the United States, so a refugee, can petition for their spouse or unmarried child to join them in the United States. So that's one way where they can be together within the US. And the other way is through P3 priority status. So refugees who are spouses, unmarried children under the age of 21, or parents of individuals already resettled within the US can come through under the P3 status. But we're seeing heavy backlogs with that, and that's why we're seeking oversight within the administration to clear those backlogs. Next slide, please. So some proposals to strengthen and rebuild the refugee resettlement program and really support family reunification within the US for refugees. First and foremost, what we're looking at is the refugee admissions goal, especially right now. President Biden announced that he would be revising the refugee admissions goal for this year to 62,500. And that's really important because currently the admissions goal is 15,000 from the current administration. And as I mentioned before, we've seen heavy dismantlement of the program, and this is causing delays of families being reunified because of restrictive categories for resettlement as well. So right now we're really pushing for the administration to just sign the revised refugee admissions goal. He's already met the statutory requirement to meet with Congress to revise the goal. So it's really important that we're pushing for that so families can be reunified, especially because this is having real life consequences. Over 200 plus flights were canceled for refugees to be resettled because of those strict allocation categories that are still in place since we are still under the previous report to Congress. Additionally, ways that we can strengthen family unity and family reunification for refugees within the US is expanding and expediting processing for the P3 priority status and the follow to join status that I referenced previously, and making sure that we can address the backlogs. And I can go into detail if folks have questions on the ways we can do that as well. And additionally, to mention the ways that we can strengthen the refugee resettlement program is through appropriations and pro-refugee legislation, which I won't get into too much detail because I know we're focusing on the RFA, but just want to mention, that all of these processes and systems are so heavily interconnected that though we're talking about refugee resettlement, once they're in the US for a year, they can apply, they can adjust status and they can apply for green cards. So then they're navigating a new system, within immigration in the US. So though it may seem a little different than other things we're talking about, it's equally important in terms of allowing immigrants and refugees to build lives together with their families in the US and be able to thrive in US communities as well. And so by advocating for, an increased refugee admissions goal and robust appropriations for refugee-related accounts, we're able to rebuild the program that was utterly dismantled by the Trump administration and make sure that we're allowed to operate the program in good faith and serve as many people as possible. And I'm happy to talk more about those bills or anything if there's more questions in the chat. So that's just an overview of the program. And again, happy to answer more questions during Q&A. And I think I'm turning it over to Justin now.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. Hey, everyone. My name is Justin Vallis. I'm the policy director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. And I actually got started in this work organizing alongside undocumented youth fighting for the DREAM Act way back in 2010. It feels a lot longer ago than I think it actually is. But I did want to take a few minutes to talk to folks about the undocumented communities here in the United States and what all these different impacts can be for important members of our community. We hear a lot about the estimates of the undocumented community being about 11 million people here in the United States. And we just wanted to make sure that we highlighted that 11 million includes more than 1.7 million Asian immigrants and over 575,000 Black immigrants. One thing that I would put as a caveat on sort of data and numbers and estimates and the complexities of discussing race in the United States, these numbers are generally based on countries of origin and may not actually fully account for the size and scope of our communities, right? Thinking, for example, Afro-Brazilians or Japanese Brazilians that come here may not actually be counted in these estimates. And so just wanted to caveat that these are rough numbers. And for us at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, also wanting to highlight that when we think about the 10 largest undocumented communities in the country, 5 of those communities are actually Asian American communities. And for folks that want to go back and take a look at slides that after the presentation, our 5 largest Asian American undocumented communities are from India, China, the Philippines, South Korea, and Vietnam. You would also not be surprised to see that those are some of the larger countries that are backlogged in our current immigration system. And as many ways as we talk about trying to fix all of the problems that we see in immigration or in the immigration system right now, there are many myriad ways that folks can become undocumented. And there's plenty of personal stories from folks that I think help illustrate it. It's folks that enter without inspection, right? Like folks that come across the border, folks that overstay visas, folks that get bad representation and bad advice and think that they're going through a process and then end up undocumented and stuck in a bad situation. And one of the complicating factors I think that is also important in thinking about what our current immigration system does to folks is that, there are definitely foreign policy ties to sort of the push-pull factors of immigration, but we've also been dealing with decades of of white nationalist nativist policy that really dig in deep on anti-immigrant narratives that play on racist tropes, and that then spur even worse policy ideas to move forward across the country and find new ways for folks to end up out of status. And I just think it's important for us to be clear that that is a part of the system that is in place and part of why we're working so hard to change this and wanting to make sure that we highlight and uplift what our communities are facing. I did want to also talk a little bit about some more technical things that both the Reuniting Families Act and the Biden bill, the USCA, are working to address. These two terms, inadmissibility and deportability, you'll hear when talking about immigration policy. Inadmissibility is basically codified in our immigration law around folks not being eligible to adjust status if they're already here, or if they're outside of the country and seeking admission, denying that visa, right? That's kind of the inadmissibility section. You'll also note that one of the things that's included in inadmissibility statutes are things called crimes of moral turpitude. It's, yeah. If anyone's interested in Googling the history of that term, definitely check that out more. The other term that we wanted to touch on really quickly was deportability. Deportability is basically the grounds that the government uses to decide whether or not to deport someone, right? It's for folks that are already here and can make them eligible for removal from the United States. Hopefully those are pretty clear. Those can become problems when folks are looking to adjust their status in very much the same way that this other thing called the 3-year bar, the 10-year bar, and the permanent bars can be basically for folks that may have accrued what's called unlawful presence or have entered without inspection and like don't have that sort of stamp in the passport on how they came in, and then get this thing technically called unlawful presence. You can start triggering some of these things like the 3 and 10-year bar. Folks that have been removed from the US can also face these, or will also face these bars when they leave, or permanent bars depending. It's a little bit complicated and I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to go too deep into something I should not be going deep on. But just know that those bars are basically prohibitions for someone trying to come back into the US. Those are definitely an issue when folks have a pathway to status, but are subject to these bars. One of the important things that is included in the Reuniting Families Act is, and also in the US Citizenship Act, would be to remove these 3, 10, and permanent bars, or the 3 and 10-year bar, and make these adjustments to take out one of these bureaucratic delays that makes it harder for families to reunite, even when there's a path, right? Like if someone is eligible for a visa, but they're subject to this bar, their ability to enter and to be reunited with their family currently depends on them waiting out that bar, right? And then being able to move forward. And it does seem kind of ridiculous, right? That you've got a letter in one hand that says like, congratulations, you can be here, but you also can't be here for another 9 years and 3 months, right? One of the ways that the Reuniting Families Act and the USCA work to address some of these things is giving discretion to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Secretary of Homeland Security, to issue waivers, which is basically giving discretion to not apply some of these rules around inadmissibility, deportability, or the bars. Generally, looking at the text, we have really strong language and really important language around strong waivers in the Reuniting Families Act. That's actually a little bit stronger than what's in the USCA. Yeah, and I think that covers this slide. Could we slide to the next, please? And since I'm talking so much about the USCA, also just wanted to give a quick overview about some of the proposals that are contained in there and some of the other things that we're looking at around legalization. Under the USCA, there's 4 kind of big components around legalization, apart from the other important components of the bill, like the Reuniting Families Act language. One would be to create a new category called lawful prospective immigrant status. That one would be a new visa category for folks that don't have a status right now to apply for, go through all the requirements and evaluations to hopefully receive a 6-year renewable status that would give them lawful presence and let them stay here. And then after at least 5 years of holding that lawful prospective immigrant status, they would then be able to apply for lawful permanent resident status or a green card, right? So not nearly as long as some of the proposals that were thrown around in 2013 with the big Senate bill. But yeah, so that's one of the key pieces in the legalization proposal within the USCA. It also includes the DREAM Act, which would allow folks to apply for their green card and lawful permanent resident status following certain criteria that continue to be the staples of what the DREAM Act is. But in the language that's in this bill, it does provide some special rules to be worked out for folks that already have their deferred action for childhood arrivals, and would be a little bit quicker path. Notice that doesn't also, or that this doesn't have that same sort of 5 to 6 year wait period before moving into those applications for their green card. Similar with the Promise Act, which would provide a lot of protections and a pathway for green cards for folks in our communities that have temporary protected status or deferred enforced departure. Those rules are all laid out in there for folks that have those statuses right now, and is pretty straightforward in the language of the bill. And then there's also the Agricultural Workers Adjustment Act, which is designed for folks that perform agricultural labor across the country and can show their the longevity of their work in agriculture to be able to apply directly into a lawful permanent resident or green card status. On top of those 4, within the USCA and outside of that bill, the Dream and Promise Act has been reintroduced in the House, and it mirrors the language that was introduced in 2019. And then in the Senate, we've also got the Dream Act that's been reintroduced and still looks pretty much similar to how it usually looks when it's been introduced. And with that, I will pass it over to Vivian.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks to all of our amazing speakers. I'm going to share just a few next steps and resources, and then we will open the floor for a lot of Q&A. So thanks everyone for all of your awesome questions. I know that we're all I'm learning a lot. I feel like we're all learning a lot. So really glad to be in this space together. But yes, if you're like, okay, how do I take action on this? What can I do next? First, please sign up for the week of action. I know some folks on this webinar have already signed up, but if you haven't yet, use that link, bit.ly/BOF Week 2021. We have an awesome slate of offices that we're trying to meet with and toolkits that we're providing. So please do that. And also, if you're not in Value Our Families already, please use that link to join. So those are 2 really quick ways, and it'll get you plugged in right into this work. And then in terms of resources, I think these are all being dropped in the chat, but we have a summary of the Reuniting Families Act, as well as information on the Advocacy Week of Action, just like a little more detail, and the chart on wait times. I was like, I know a lot of us were really staring at that and like, I'm gonna try to keep this. So we'll also send out this slide deck after the webinar. So no worries if you're like, I can't grab everything from the chat, it'll also come in your email inbox. So yeah. Okay, and let me pass the mic to Reshma to do our Q&A.
Great, thanks everyone. So we're going to start with some of the questions that were raised in the Q&A and or chat box that haven't been answered yet. So this one is from Megan. What would the process be like to bring in a parent with the medical issue?
So first, my disclaimer, this is not legal advice. You should talk to a lawyer about individual cases, et cetera, or a BIA accredited representative. But I did like this question as a hypothetical. So because if we look at go back to my chart, which I think we will for the next question, you look and you see you have to find the category you could sponsor. So the sponsoring person would have to be a US citizen. Lawful permanent residents cannot sponsor their parents. So if you check that box, I'm a US citizen, I want to sponsor my parent. Then what Justin was talking about is there's all these list of inadmissibility grounds, and you have to make sure that you aren't blocked by any of them. And so there's many, but in this particular example of a medical issue, there's a couple you look at. One is there's a requirement of a medical exam. And actually, let me just chat this because I copied it from the information on the government website. But basically, anybody trying to get a green card has to go get a medical exam. Actually, I don't know about refugees, so Alyssa could correct me, but most people trying to get a green card have to get a medical exam, and for many non-immigrant visas as well. And they're looking to certify, first of all, you are required to get a lot of vaccinations. You're required to not have a communicable disease. So we are seeing people, some of these bans around COVID, right? But if the illness is something like, high blood pressure, heart disease, things that are not communicable diseases, usually it's not a problem, but then we have this whole other set of, there's other rules. And one of them is the public charge rule, which you've heard about because it was a huge deal under Trump. And we had good news just yesterday on the public charge rule. And that is basically the public charge rule was trying to exclude people based on wealth, but also based on age and health conditions. So they were under Trump looking at things like, could look at things like high blood pressure or any other kind of, common diseases that old people have, older people tend to have more often. Anyway, so the good news is I think it's been enjoined by a court, but they were going to the Supreme Court on it because the Biden administration had not changed course yet, but there was news yesterday that I think they've settled. They're not going to the Supreme Court, and that's an indication that actually the Biden administration is going to get rid of the Trump rule, but we're waiting on further information on that. I expect we go back to the old rule, which is mostly about what the rule was intended to be, that they want to make sure people don't end up destitute and reliant on the government. And so typically families who are sponsoring family members just have to sign an affidavit that said, under Obama and previous law, an affidavit saying, I promise to support this person financially if they cannot support themselves. And I can show you that I can do that because this is my salary and income information. And if one person doesn't have enough salary and income information in the old days, 2 or 3 people, like, a cousin could say, I'm also going to help, so that they could pool their salary to get to the threshold. Anyway, so we had bad law on that under Trump, and it looks like we're getting another victory and getting that fixed, but more information will be forthcoming on that front.
Great, thank you, Megan. Then for the next question, we have, on the visa chart, what are the definitions of the first column terms? First, family preference, second, a family preference, etc. And what's the difference between the spouse in the first category and the third, second, a family category?
So my apologies, if we can go back to that slide. Oh, good, we're going back to that slide. I'm going to chat. The definitions are on the USCIS website. I'm chatting the definitions. I should have spent more time on this. The definitions are kind of what we have in the chart. So you look at the first column and it says US citizen. That's the person, the sponsor. So, and then the next chart is who they're sponsoring. So it's US citizen, then you look to the next column, relationship. That just means that the US citizen can sponsor a spouse, an unmarried mild children, or a parent in this category. So then if you look at first family preference category, under citizen status of US family member says US citizen. This just says that for this category, the definition is that US citizens may sponsor the next column over unmarried adult children. I don't know if I'm doing a better job of explaining it, but I would click on the link that I chatted in the USCIS where they define those categories.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we have another question here, which is, these numerical limits seem to be based in white supremacy and yearnings for a white ethnostate. How do we address that and get rid of these arbitrary caps?
Another good question. So I did want to just share with some, I mean, I guess a little bit of irony that this system was created in 1965 when the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And it ended really racist national origin quota system that started with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then after people from China were excluded, there were other laws that excluded most Asians from getting green cards in the United States. And including, there were at the time people from China living in the United States, and they were barred from citizenship, even if they already had a green card. And then it got worse, and they started also this quota system that limited people, even within Europe. They were prioritizing Northern and Western Europeans because they wanted to keep the Italians and the Spanish out too, and others, but you know, at the time, definitely Italians. And so that's what we had before this system. And, you know, I think the system was a compromise, not to say that racism was certainly not gone in Congress when this law was passed. And if you look at the congressional record, there was definitely explicit conversation about people of color coming in, but it was meant, the country caps are meant to balance diversity, and they've caused problems. And we have gone back and forth in a coalition of getting rid of them entirely. But I will say members of the Congressional Black Caucus flagged concerns for us because getting rid of the country caps entirely will preference certain countries over others. And as Diana talked about, African immigrants do not have a lot of pathways. And so it would it could impact diversity negatively. So there's an interest in balancing competing interests. And then on top of that, there's also, you could do an open borders bill, and maybe somebody will do an open borders bill one day. But if you're not in the open borders world and you're talking about, this is one way of balancing interests, I think we could all come up with our own ideas of, well, we should let in more refugees, or more diversity, or more from Africa, or more employment, or more, most of us here are not promoting more employment, but I'm just saying, it's a conversation. We're open to, and this is a bill that we've pushed to the left. Every year it's been introduced in the last 3 Congresses by adding more progressive language to it. And we are open to suggestions. I think there is more conversations about getting rid of some of the caps entirely, and maybe we'll get there with the members of Congress. But we also, just last year, we're fighting with Democrats about not having a merit-based system like Canada, which would definitely prioritize wealthy people and whiter people, but definitely wealthy, as it does in Canada, and is like very neoliberal. So we think family and humanitarian needs should be prioritized with a balance of diversity and making sure there's pathways for Black immigrants. Sorry, that's a lot of long answer, but it is kind of the central question, I think, of like, how do you structure an immigration system?
Thank you, Megan. Okay, the next question is, do any of the proposed changes to immigration law focus on helping incarcerated or formerly incarcerated immigrants stay within the country? How are proposed changes to immigration law countering the quote unquote bad immigrant narrative? And so I don't know who would like to take that. Justin or make it?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to share a little bit. I think this is an important and crucial conversation to have about the narratives of criminalization and the impact, particularly on communities of color, and the disparate impact on Black immigrants and other folks as well. Right now, one of the key pieces that is included in RFA is that waiver, right? And providing some of that space to kind of blot out some of the prior interaction with the criminal legal system in consideration of a person being able to stay here with their family, right? Those are important changes that I think we're all here fighting for. Another bill, like there are definitely other immigration bills out there. One of the ones that you may have heard about is called the New Way Forward bill that was introduced by Congressman Chuy Garcia of Illinois. Sorry, I had to do a shameless shout out because I live in the 4th district. But that's another one that really seeks to challenge some of the criminalization of our communities in immigration policy. And so definitely that's another one to check out and take a look at.
Yeah, I'll just add, we
Go
don't,
ahead.
Value Our Families doesn't address everything, but I think everyone on this call supports the New Way Forward Act, and there is a separate coalition that any of us could connect you to if that's more of the types of issues you want to focus on.
Okay, well, I think piggybacking on that, I think there's interest in learning about how do folks stay on top of all the legislation and major changes.
No, nobody wants to take it. I don't stay on, my full-time job is immigration policy, and I don't stay on top of everything. That's where we have to carve out our priorities. I think what Trump did to asylum is horrendous, but I cannot tell you that I could name everything he did. I do not stay on top of asylum, but I know who to call if I have questions about asylum, and I try to sign on to their letters. We retweet their stuff, and we try to be supportive. And most of, I think a lot of that stuff we think Biden can fix on his own. It's not a legislation as focus as much. So there's also the what can we push Biden to do? What can we push? What do we have to get done through legislation? And then some stuff is gray area, but none of us stay on top of everything, do we?
I mean, it's exhausting to try and stay on top of all of it. And I think one of the key parts, stay connected with Value Our Families. We definitely signal boost things that come across that are similar. Stay connected to the member organizations if you're not already, and finding folks that you trust that are active and plugged in on those issues. Those are helpful ways. Get involved with some of your community, some of the other folks doing the organizing around these issues. It's a great way to stay up to date as best you can. But yeah, it is a lot, and they're all very long bills too.
So one thing we'd like to do, and thanks to the panelists for answering these questions and for all of you who've been chatting them, we would want to give an opportunity for folks if you want to raise your hand. I have one more question here that I'm going to ask, but if you'd like to raise your hand, we have about a little over 10 minutes left. We can unmute some of you to ask your questions directly. So please raise your hands. But there is a question here around whether there's any differences in how the process will be managed online, because past cases were filed by paper or mail. Will it be streamlined?
I mean, mean, I'm not keeping tabs on every process that they're moving to online, but I know in the naturalization context, I think it's been pretty successful. Actually, they were having problems the other way where they were processing applications faster online, so that when people are doing paper, because you can still choose, when people are doing paper, it was taking longer. But then there's like a lot of folks in our communities, older folks, people with language barriers, where sitting down and doing the paper application is better for them, but then they shouldn't be punished by their application taking longer. So that's the only area I'm like really familiar, or a little bit familiar with the online, but they are trying to transition all applications to an online option eventually.
So we do have a question from Joanna. So I'm going to unmute you, Joanna.
Hi, how is everybody? Thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. I went ahead and put my question in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and read it. First, can you opt out of vaccinations? Are you familiar if families are able to do that? And second, what if the undocumented individual had an IEP or special needs? Would that expedite the process?
Okay, great. So who would like to take that?
I don't know the answer on vaccinations. I don't think all vaccinations are required, and I imagine that there is an exception, but I just, it's would be better to ask a practitioner. And what was the second part? Sorry, I know it was about IEPs. Was it about undocumented people or general?
Yeah, this has to do with undocumented. So what if the undocumented person had special needs or had some certain like IEP? Would they be able to be expedited quicker?
I'm not aware of any way to expedite applications based on those kinds of needs, but.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. So do we have others? I don't see other hands raised. Do we have others who have questions and would like to ask? No?
I know Jenna had raised her hand earlier and she just put a question in the chat. So
For
Jenna,
Alyssa.
yeah. If you want to unmute or if you want to.
Actually, since the question is in the chat, is there anything other than increasing refugee numbers that's being done to rebuild the refugee resettlement infrastructure that was destroyed by the Trump administration? So yeah, can maybe turn that over to you, Alyssa.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we are advocating for multiple pathways to do that. Currently, right now, we're working with congressional champions to introduce pro-refugee legislation that I mentioned in the slides. One of them being the Refugee Protection Act, which would modernize both the refugee and asylum system. And that's a larger bill that includes extensive provisions on different ways of helping with integration, strengthening the program, oversight of the administration. Additionally, with the appropriations process, like I mentioned, the ways that we do that is asking for increased funding for refugee-related accounts. And that's both domestic and overseas. So domestically, that's through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So by asking for that increased funding, we're able to ensure that we have the infrastructure, social services, and integration processes for refugees who are resettled once we see the increase of arrivals, hopefully this fiscal year, possibly next fiscal year. So those are just some of the ways that we're hoping to rebuild the program.
Great, thank you. There was a question earlier around an update on the HEALS Act. I don't know if anyone, just had the information on that. I know that's a little bit outside the scope.
Yeah, I mean, we work, if it's the HEAL Immigrant Families Act, we work with NAPOF on that. I mean, we support NAPOF. NAPOF the National Asian, you're gonna make me do the acronyms, Women's, I don't know.
Women's Forum, yes.
Women's Forum, thank you. They kind of lead in the Asian American space on that bill, and it is for expanding healthcare access to immigrants. I think it's been, with COVID, really brought to life that, lifted up that we shouldn't be excluding immigrants from healthcare access and the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid. And so anyway, so we support that bill. I know NAPAF is working to have, it's going to be reintroduced this year, but I don't know when. I think in the coming months.
Great, thank you. So are there any more questions or that people would either like to chat or raise their hand? If not, do we have any closing comments from any of the panelists? I know we've covered a lot today, and really appreciative. I don't know, we've heard about employment, diversity, kind of the overall system. Alyssa, you just answered a question on refugees. Just any heads up or on things that you feel like you weren't able to get to and would like to point out. Okay. All right. Well, thank you to all the speakers and to everyone who attended. It was really great to be here with all of you. And, if there's any follow-up questions, please email it to us or, Value Our Families. Go onto our website. There's always information about, activities that we're working on. And so thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to all of the attendees and speakers, and we look forward to seeing you again at some of our activities.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.